Randy Credico live on the fly here with Reggie Johnson at the soundboard. And this is where Live on the Fly wants to be a fly on the wall because for the first time, I've got these two gentlemen together, and they are so brilliant. And they're both recipients, by the way, of the prestigious Sam Adams Award. You know, Ray McGovern's group, Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, got it in 2005. By the way, you got to read his book, Seconder Burns, Scott Ritter has my copy, by the way. Send it back, Scott. And Lawrence Wilkerson, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, received it in 2009. I don't know if you two gentlemen know each other, but it's great to have you together at the same time. And Craig, you and I were speaking this morning. I want you to introduce Colonel Wilkerson and tell me what you said about him this morning.
Yeah. Well, Barry, of course, was Chief of Staff to Colin Powell and had a extremely distinguished military career before that. We have met. We've met at least once, and I think more often. Notably, I remember at an occasion at Oxford University. I don't remember what we were both doing there, but I do recall it was Oxford University. Yes, I told you this morning that my great friend, the late Alex Salmond, had a very interesting series of interview programs on TV channels. First Russian Today, and then on the Turkish news channel. And I said to him, "You must interview Larry Wilkerson. He's someone you really must have on your show because I think he's probably one of the most interesting and intelligent people I've ever met." Never told Larry I said that. He's probably laughing, but yeah. So I'm delighted to be on your show with Larry.
Oh, Larry, any response to that?
I'd say I loved reading. Well, I won't say I loved reading, but I look forward to reading Craig's cables, even if they were sometimes dusted off and cleaned up maybe by the chain of commission, the way they got to me. But I remember one distinctly about. I think it was from Craig when he was in Uzbekistan about certain people boiling other people in oil or something to that effect, and Powell being disbelieving of that sort of thing until other people started telling him about what Uzbekistan at that time was really like, and I think he became a pretty much of a believer after that. But we've traveled some of the same roads together. He a lot more bravely and courageously than I. Took me a while. I'm a dumb soldier to figure out what was going on around me and who was doing it. I'm still not quite sure. I'm doing a BBC interview tomorrow. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to say because the subject matter is very dense and very complicated, and my memory, I've tried to refresh my memory from my notes over the last 3 or 4 hours, but my memory is fading on me. And what I do remember about it, particularly the events that occurred over the 7 days that were pretty much ensconced at Langley, and then the one day and night in New York. And I'm still not totally clear over what happened to us there, but I'm much clearer than I was in the past. And I keep discovering new culprits, new people to point the finger at, and new people to be accused of some pretty heinous things. But all of it fades in comparison to what's going on right now. So, Randy, you love to talk about what's going on right now. I'm sure Craig does too,
Yeah.
from his perspective.
Well, I know what's going on with you, Craig, a little bit. You are in Scotland, and you've been battling against this Anti-Terrorism Act, its provisions and repercussions on people across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. Can you tell us where it is right now, where the fight is, and how you feel? Are you optimistic about breaking down this wall against free speech?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that the world has become even darker and much darker since Larry and I both worked for our respective governments. Um, and in particular, the ability of people to dissent at home is under attack in a way which I would never have expected to see, to be honest. The area of the speech and permitted dissent is shrinking and shrinking. And there are numerous legislative and judicial uh, actions over the last year which are making things worse and worse. But the one in particular in the UK we're talking about now is the prescription of Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, um, which has led to over 3,500 people in the UK being arrested and facing charges for terrorism. And it should say they said over 30% of those people being charged with terrorism are over the age of 70, which is extraordinary. And the vast majority of them are being charged for holding up placards saying, I support Palestine Action. Um, there are, uh, Palestine Action is a direct action organization which aims to do damage to the
30 seconds on
Israeli
and 30 seconds.
which aims to do damage to the Israeli weapons companies in the UK, and that's acknowledged to be against the criminal law. When you take part in civil disobedience, you're breaking the law. These are people who think that damaging a weapons factory and breaking drones literally is a moral act when it's helping to stop a genocide. But people accept that they can be found guilty of criminal damage and sentenced to up to a year or two in jail for criminal damage. But to call that terrorism absolutely demeans the very idea of terrorism. Terrorism is widely viewed everywhere in the world as actions that endanger life, not property. It would be terrorism if you damaged an air traffic control center, for example, but that's because you're endangering life. Um, so we've had a series of legal actions, and we're challenging it separately in England and in Scotland because they're separate legal jurisdictions. In England, the Court of Appeal recently reversed the initial ruling in favour of Palestine Action. The Court of Appeal basically said that it was an anti-judicial activism ruling from the English Court of Appeal. They said that basically the courts had to trust the executive to do their job. The courts shouldn't intervene, was essentially what they said. In Scotland, we've not managed to get the judicial under-review underway at all because it's been continually delayed by procedural motions from the British government. And every time we have to fight through one of these procedural motions, it costs us about £50,000. Wow. So we're still battling on. But both legal cases are still in transit through the courts. I must say it's taken up a huge amount of my time and energy this last couple of months, especially simply because of the cost, I'm having to do an awful lot of the grunt work and research work myself, just because we're running out of money to pay lawyers to do much other than the appear in court bit that only they can do. Sorry, that was a rather a long answer, but that's what I've been doing.
We don't have that kind of problem here, do we, Colonel Wilkerson? There's
Oh,
no
not
repression.
at all. Marco Rubio just delineates everyone that he doesn't like or that he thinks is in the category that Craig just outlined briefly for England, or anyone that opposes Marco Rubio is a communist.
Right.
We're all communists now. Ben Cohen's a communist. You've heard about that, I'm sure.
No,
Ben
I heard
is a communist. Amy, what's her name?
Goodman.
From Democracy.
Amy Goodman.
Yeah, Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! She's a communist. Of course. Code Pink is all full of communists supported by the Chinese communists. No recognition that the Chinese haven't really been communists for quite a while. and, and all these people are communists. And Ben Cohen is at the peak of the communist group because he's giving money to all these causes like sending solar power generators to Santiago de Cuba after Melissa hit. You can't make this stuff up. And then I read this morning that his conversation with Sergei Lavrov in Manila lasted about 30 minutes, and they touched the issues you would think they would touch: Ukraine and Russia's status vis-a-vis Ukraine and the war in Iran and so forth. The only thing that they could agree on, the only thing, and they came away from the meeting with nothing agreed except this: the space program would continue with the United States riding mostly on Russia's expertise and thrust power. The space program would continue. I'm happy for that. I'm glad it is continuing. But the other issues they talked about, for example, they talked about Anchorage and the Anchorage Agreement, and Lavrov, rightfully, for about the eighth time, in terms of Rubio, maybe the second time, what is wrong? Why did you violate that? Why did you negate that? That was the basis of a renewed relationship between Moscow and Washington. And Rubio said, well, Zelensky didn't like it. Imagine how that made Sergei Lavrov feel. So this is a gentleman who is National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. He's neither. He's conniving right now to get Trump into the diversion mode because he's losing so badly in Southwest Asia, to go after Cuba. Nice diversion there. We'd be able to handle Cuba, he's saying. So we're in real trouble in this country with our Secretary of State, the chief diplomat, if you will, because he's no diplomat and he's no Secretary of State, and nor is he a national security advisor, because Trump doesn't need any national security advisor. He's smarter than anybody who would be national security advisor. So our dilemma is profound right now and only going to get worse. This is a president who the other day was photographed walking behind a column, I think it was at the White House, with the Secret Service and military on the other side, kind of, looking into their hands, as it were, taking a leak. And maybe a couple of other things, too. You couldn't tell from the disgust on the face of the people surrounding the column. So his incontinence, and I'm one to talk about this because I'm fairly incontinent myself now at 82, but his incontinence is brought right out into the public where people can observe, and not getting any better, and it matches the dementia that's running around in his head, apparently, because he hasn't made two consistent statements. I know that's really a criticism often made of him, but he hasn't made two consistent statements within a 60-minute period in about 2 weeks. Or you could say, fundamentally, since he started this stupid war of choice with Iran. So we're in a mess, Randy. We're in a real mess, and I frankly do not see how anytime soon we extricate ourselves from it.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into the Mideast or West Africa and Eastern Europe, Craig, I want to add on to what Larry just laid out on Cuba, because you just spent a lot of time in Venezuela. Before and after, I believe, the coup down there. What's your sense of what is happening in Cuba from your side of the pond, and also what is happening in Venezuela? Because it's hard to get a clear picture.
Yeah, I'll start with Venezuela. Venezuela is really interesting. Yeah, I spent in total nearly 3 months there. I had a severe heart problem while I was there, and my life was saved by the Venezuelan National Health Service, and they gave me an emergency heart procedure and installed a pacemaker for me. So I will forever be grateful to the people of Venezuela, with excellent Cuban and Cuban-trained doctors who actually saved my life. So, and that, of course, is something which Cuba has done a fantastic job for all over the world. I spent much of my foreign service career in Africa, where Cuban doctors were fundamental to the healthcare provision available in many African countries. So just a point to note on the way along. Venezuela is really interesting because what has happened is effectively piracy in that the government has basically, the American government has basically used the US Navy to seize control of Venezuelan oil resources by the simple measure of putting a fleet off the coast which seizes any vessel which is containing oil not sold according to the approval of the United States. Now, there's no signed agreement. The Venezuelan government have not signed up to this. The the US Treasury has taken control of sales of Venezuelan oil without any authority to do so from the Venezuelan government. That's certainly true. So, in that respect, this is simple, almost piracy. A state can't do piracy, but it's pure physical military force taking control of the monopoly of Venezuela's oil resources. But there's another side to this story which people don't know, um, and which is actually quite interesting. There was a big article in the Financial Times 2 days ago asking what has happened to $16 billion worth of Cuban oil revenue, which has been collected by the US Treasury since they took it over in January. And actually, the answer to that is quite interesting because the answer is that strangely, Trump is actually behaving much better than he wants people to think he is behaving, because he wants to claim that he's actually stolen all that money for the United States and the United States is making a lot of money out of this, whereas in fact the opposite is true, and the amount of money the US is making out of it is almost certainly a good deal less than the cost of a naval operation. My information is direct from Delcy Rodriguez herself, and it's a couple of months out of date. It's 2 months since I was there. But in the first 4 months of this operation, and I have no reason to believe this has changed, I believe this is true. The United States was paying 97.5% of the money it gained from Cuban oil sales.
Venezuela,
The US,
Venezuela.
the US Treasury was paying to Venezuela, back to the Venezuelan Treasury, and it was doing so within 1 week. The Americans were keeping, which is a huge cheek, of course, a 2.5% service charge for the cost of stealing Venezuela's oil. They were charging the Venezuelans 2.5%. But 97.5% was getting of the revenue was getting to the Venezuelan treasury within a week. And that's not public. That's never been published anywhere. And as I say, the FT and others were publishing big articles saying, where's the money going? Actually, it is going to Venezuela. And strangely enough, Trump is hiding that and trying to appear to be doing something worse than he is doing because it plays well to his base, for his base to think the money is being stolen. But in fact, it's not being stolen. It is actually going to Venezuela. That doesn't make the system acceptable. It doesn't make it legal. It's actually exactly the same system that the US uses with Iraqi oil. But that is the truth of it at the moment as regards the oil revenue.
Wow. Well, what do you say to that, Colonel Wilkerson? I mean, this guy is such a mercenary. I can't imagine that he'd give him even 2%, let alone 97%. And where's that revenue coming from? Who are they selling it to, the U.S.?
What I'd like to know, Randy, is who's getting the money in Venezuela, especially with the crushing earthquake results they're under right now. Who is actually getting the large share of that money in Venezuela? Is there any supervision of that? Is there anybody watching that? Is there anybody concerned with that? Because if it's typical Venezuela, it's not going to the Venezuelan people in any way, fashion, or form, and it's probably not even being used for the kind of effort that is necessary to try and salvage something from this earthquake. It's true that we're down there with, I think it's the 24th MEU. One of the MEUs is down there, and other aviation assets supporting them, trying to help them deal with the results of this earthquake. And that's costing some, I'm sure, too. You can't put them there without paying for them. And I don't think we're charging Venezuela. I think we're doing that on our own behalf. Humanitarian Disaster Relief Operation Funds in the DOD, DOW. But I really would like to know because it's always been a problem in Venezuela with Maduro, with Chavez. It might have been a little bit better with Hugo Chavez, but it's always been a problem. Where is the money going?
Craig?
Yeah, um, it it has been a problem in Venezuela. Part part of that problem is as well exacerbated by sanctions because again, it's interesting when you really get into a place and understand the complexity of a situation. It throws up all kinds of interesting things that you hadn't thought of previously. And here's one that I had never thought of until I was there and encountered it and was able to interview people involved in it. The most effective sanctions that the West has taken against Venezuela have been essentially its suspension from the SWIFT system and from really cutting it off from the entire international banking system, which made the transfer of money and international payments almost impossible. One of the results of that was that the Venezuelan government was obliged, um, in order to survive, in order to be able to import or export anything, was obliged to work alongside people who had expertise in the shadow world of illegal international money transfer and transactions in various ways. So the government of Venezuela basically got very close to crooks, people who were crooks on a large scale, used to doing $1 billion international money transfers under the counter. Um, and that led to a corrosion in the values. I'm not saying there was no corruption before this happened. Of course there was. Then there's corruption more or less everywhere. But that led to a spectacular increase, if you like, in the uh, in the corrupt atmosphere around uh, Venezuelan government dealings, which undoubtedly became a problem. Now, interestingly, and I hope I'm not a terrifically naive person, but I genuinely think that one thing we have seen is Delcy Rodriguez, to some extent, acting to clear out a lot of those influences. That's something which I think I detected. All of this is very hard to get a firm grip on because, of course, it's all happening within the Chavista party, and people aren't terrifically open about precisely who's in and who's out and how these international machinations of government are carried on. But I don't have any doubt that corruption was much accelerated by Western sanctions, strangely enough, but also that the situation is to some extent being being cleaned up at the moment.
All right. We're, we're, we're 20 minutes in, and we haven't said a word about the war in Iran or in Ukraine.
Let me make one comment, Randy, before we go on. If you've read Misha Glenny's book, I know it's a little bit old now, and all that means is it's gotten worse, not better. You know that the black economy in the world is somewhere around $10 trillion annually. I suspect it's 20 to 25 trillion now. And you know that the capitals of this economy are Tel Aviv, number one, Dubai, number two, New York, number three, and then others fall in. Panama used to be close, but since the Panama Papers, I think it's retreated a little bit. But what Misha tells you in that book, and what was going to be in the HBO special that only aired one section because Israel objected and got it canceled. But what was in that book and vividly displayed in that movie, they started with a Jewish mafia boss. That's probably the reason it got killed so quickly. What was displayed was what happens with this money vis-a-vis our sanctions. Our sanctions on something like, last time I checked the OFAC figures, I think it was 32 countries. It amounted to about 2 billion people. Our sanctions actually feed this process, just as Craig was suggesting. They help this process. The UN Oil for Food program, for example, and workarounds on that program helped majorly to make these centers a lot of money. And what these centers do, like Tel Aviv and Dubai and New York and so forth, what they do is launder this money. And our banks, particularly in this country, our banks make a fortune off of it because they don't pay any attention to where it's coming from. They don't care about its provenance. They just care about their 7-8% that they're making, washing it and cleaning it. So sanctions and our massive sanctions regime, and no one knows more about this than the Chinese, mind you. Our sanctions regime actually, as Craig suggested, vis-a-vis Venezuela, actually aid and abet this black economy that's growing and growing and really becoming competitive with the legitimate economy.
Wow. Well, speaking of sanctions, there are new sanctions imposed on Russia, and I think the UK is going along with it. I thought the page would be turned on all of that, Craig, with your new prime minister.
When it comes to foreign affairs, then Andy Burnham is certainly no better than Keir Starmer, and if possible, worse. He's a very, very active Zionist, great supporter of the war in Ukraine, a great purveyor of Russophobia. I'm not not expecting to see any kind of improvements at all in foreign policy from Andy Burnham, and on top of which he's made an absolute point of saying, his first priority is if you like, the military-industrial complex. They're talking up the defence industry, saying that they're going to pursue a policy of reindustrialisation through defence. So no, he's even more of a warmonger. I'm sorry to say, and this whole narrative that Russia is about to invade the United Kingdom, or Russia's liable to declare war on the United Kingdom, which is a nonsense. Russia does not have the ability to fight all of Western Europe. Russia does not have the ability to fight its way through to London. And that's even if it had the desire, which of course it doesn't have, more fundamentally. But this whole extreme fear-mongering narrative about Russia, which is way beyond the bounds of rationality, is continuing and even being stepped up.
Well, how far can it go, Colonel Wilkerson? These pinpricks are causing damage to civilian infrastructure. What's the name of that big warehouse like Amazon that was torched twice, blown up, and some oil refineries, and with weapons that are being provided now by Western European countries. Are they crossing the line? How much longer can Russia tolerate the West pretending that they're not involved when they are directly involved, because they're giving them the information, the ISR, and they're giving them the weapons? How much longer are they? How patient can they be?
Well, that's the question for Ukraine, I think. It's a question of the day, the question of the hour, whatever you want to call it. I think, as the ambassador has implied, and as Glenn Dyson said off camera with me when he was interviewing me the other day, the Europeans have gone mad. They've gone mad at Brussels. They've gone mad at EU headquarters. They've gone mad with each of the individual countries, especially the ones that count in terms of relative power. They've just gone insane. And I think Putin and Lavrov and others around Putin have made up their minds, and the most important person in this, I still think, is Putin, that they're at war with NATO. There's no question about it. They are. So they're pondering now just what to do about that, to indicate in a very visible way, but one that is not so terribly escalatory, that they understand that. And I think what is materializing here very shortly will be an attack on a NATO target, probably in a NATO country, It won't be Germany, it won't be France, it won't be England. It'll probably be one of the smaller ones, say Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, somewhere like that. And it will be genuinely a NATO target supporting Ukraine because Russia's intelligence is good enough to tell them that from that country. And it'll be a bevy of Oreshniks or some other equivalent missile. And then Putin will stand back as the smoke clears and dare NATO to do anything about it. And then we're off to the races if NATO remains and Washington remains as brain dead, as wooden headed, as stupid as it has proved to be ever since the SMO started. So this will be a really dicey moment, I think. At the same time, they are methodically plodding along, and despite the drone attacks and such, which incidentally the recent ones, probably the World Food Program is now saying that, and Russia's not being to export to the South now, that and what is happening in Southwest Asia with this war of choice with Iran are probably going to deepen the World Food Program and other programs like that's problems to the extent that lots and lots of people are going to starve to death. And I'm not even talking about the urea and the fertilizer and the other ingredients and everything that simply aren't going to make it out to the places they need to make it to. And there's no way to catch up on this because it's already stopped. And now we're blockaded again in the Bab el-Mandeb, and we're blockaded in the Strait of Hormuz. And nothing's going to get out of consequence. And what's on the high seas barely even meets the daily requirement. So we're really making Ukraine and Southwest Asia a part of the same theater at the same time. And we're revealing that in Israel, they can't even control their streets. They've almost got a civil war going on inside Israel. The dimensions of the problems they have right now are illustrated by the number of people they put in jail without any kind of recompense whatsoever or any appeal to legality at all. And the election that's running up right now is looking like it's just going to deepen this. And if Bibi can't get his visit with Trump to get his bump in the polls, which is why he does it, and things really turn sour for him and he goes to jail and his wife along with him, he's got a pacemaker now, he's got a swollen prostate, maybe going to have prostate surgery. It's really looking bad inside Israel, and we've got all our tankers stacked up on their airports and presenting the most ripe, rich target array to Iran should it want to resume again in terms of attacking Israel. You can't go much further without entering a realm of who's going to use a nuclear weapon first. And you know, I'm one of those who believes that the Iranians made a decision, and they were not very far away from this decision anyway, if they hadn't made it preliminarily. When the Ayatollah was killed, and when that happened, and you now have no moderates, no hardliners, everybody is a Persian now, if they're Persian or not. They're all Iranian citizens now. They're resolute. The bombs haven't done anything but make them more resolute. So we're talking about two nuclear powers potentially standing off against one another, and there's no doubt in my mind that when Golda Meir told that BBC reporter in 1973 when he asked her if she would use a nuclear weapon, and without batting an eye she said yes, that she was serious. It wasn't just for the Russians to hear that. It wasn't just for Washington to hear that. It was for everyone in the world to know that Israel had nuclear weapons and they would use one. And I have no doubt that Bibi Netanyahu or whoever might replace him, who looks as if it's one of those who are contending now, is worse than Bibi, I believe it.
Wow. Craig Murray.
Yeah, no, it's very hard to understand that we've come to this point where governments are so reckless with the idea of the start of a nuclear war. And I should say that particularly now, given the news of the Saudi-American nuclear deal, that if you were Tehran, if you were Iranian, you would be crazy not to want a nuclear weapon at this stage. We know that the late Ayatollah was against it, but he's no longer with us. But everything is pointing towards escalation of war and deliberate escalation of war essentially because people make money out of war. They make money out of the defense industry. They make money out of bombs. With manipulation of the markets has been an awful lot to do with all the extraordinary on, off, on announcements all the time from Trump to Axios. Money is being made. And we have a world which is controlled by people who are, without disguise, really, much more interested in amassing personal fortunes than they are about the good of the world. We seem to be embarked in this near suicidal course of escalation, both in Europe and in Southwest Asia. So it's extremely difficult to see where and how this stops, and it just gets worse. It's probably more acute now than it has ever been, and the crisis with Iran is utterly unnecessary. It can do no possible good to anybody. The United States has got itself into this position where it doesn't seem to have any very definite objective other than reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, was perfectly open and free until they started this stupid war. I also want to make one other point, which is this inability to think through long-term consequences. The Strait of Hormuz isn't the only strait in the world, and it was long understood by Western governments that freedom of navigation was an essential Western interest, and that once you start closing straits, everyone's going to suffer. If you look at the Malaccan Strait, which Indonesia has always hankered after being able to close to control traffic through, to charge passage charges, and about a third of the world's trade goes through the Malaccan Straits. You've had the United Kingdom effectively closing the Strait of Dover to Russian shipping, which fundamentally breaches the right of passage through straits. But those kind of, if you like, pillars of the world international order, which were understood to be necessary to long-term Western interests, it's part of this, this general failure to view peace and trade and mutual prosperity as something in which everyone gains. Everyone is now viewed as an enemy to be destroyed, and the entire international system is teetering on the brink of complete collapse.
Randy, let me just give you an assessment that I got this morning real quickly.
Yeah. No, go right ahead.
The price of the war is becoming unescapable everywhere. Brent crude jumped 5.6% on July 23rd to roughly 99 a barrel. If China fills its strategic petroleum reserve rapidly, you'll see it go to 120 or 130. But this is the highest since the war began, as Houthi strikes on 2 Saudi tankers in the Red Sea compounded the seizure of the Strait of Hormuz. Buyers in Asia are weighing longer, costlier routes. Each detour adds weeks of time and additional expense. With Hormuz effectively closed since late February, and the Houthis now enforcing a blockade with 2 burning Saudi tankers to prove it, a fifth of the world's seaborne oil and much of its liquefied natural gas is under threat at 2 choke points at once. Every rise in the crude price feeds directly into the fertilizer, freight, and food costs. The World Food Program is talking about that with quite a bit of anxiety. Higher oil prices mean higher inflation, which means the Federal Reserve cannot cut rates to relieve a debt bubble straining under its own weight. The trap now closing on a bankrupt transatlantic order. Will Anglo-American NATO find a way out itself? And it just goes on and on about Besant and what he's doing right now, what he's doing with $100 billion in securities that really shouldn't be being dealt with the way they're being dealt with right now. And what he's doing in terms of obfuscating this, maybe even from the president, though I think that would be hard to do given this president and his predilection for money. And then it goes on talking about what the potential is for the next week or two and then the next month or so in terms of the markets, in terms of global recession for sure, and global depression possibly, if we continue on this route. So we're not just hurting the warring parties, we're doing in incredible damage to Iran, we're hurting the globe, and we're going to hurt the globe even more.
Craig, how do we get out of this mess?
It's it's very difficult to see how. And to me, you've got to view it all as a holistic whole. Um, the reason that we're having so much authoritarian legislation at home, so much categorization of people as communists or terrorists if they dare to voice opposition, so much clamping down on free speech. The reason for all of that is, of course, that the popular support for a lot of these actions, popular support for these wars just isn't there. There's been a massive turnaround in U.S. popular opinion on Israel. Again, I must admit, I'm rather pleased about that. That's also something I didn't expect to ever see in my lifetime, which is a very substantial movement against Israeli aggression in the United States among ordinary people. The narrative has been lost control of by these warmongering governments. Nobody in the, well, not nobody, but the majority of people in the United States do not want to go into a serious conflict with Iran. They don't want a vast increase in the price of gas. They don't want inflation. They don't want high interest rates. They don't want all the consequences, let alone the fact that if things get more serious and they do something daft like a ground invasion, you're going to get an awful lot of dead soldiers. None of the public want any of this, but people can see what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, can see what Israel is doing to Lebanon. They don't want that to happen either. But there's a fundamental failing in Western democracy because people have no ability to actually stop it because the party systems are well ingrained and those party systems are under the control of this unaccountable elite who are behind and controlling the politicians. They're not the politicians themselves. And all of it is being conducted in the interests of making a small number of people extremely wealthy. But that again has to be seen as a whole with the general stagnation in living standards for ordinary working people. When I was a young man, there was a genuine expectation that you would have a better life than your parents had, and your children would have a better life than you. That's now completely out the window, and the chances of my children being able to enjoy as full and as economically independent a life as I managed to enjoy are very, very limited. And that's true for my entire generation. And the generation coming after them, things are looking even bleaker. And at the same time, you have this growth. You now have the world's first trillionaire. You have this vast growth in the billionaire class of people who don't actually really do anything much useful at all. So all of these rotten developments in society are part of a whole. I think it's very, very important to understand that the warmongering, the breakdown of international order is part of the same force that has ended social cohesion and a move towards greater social equality and social mobility at home. This is part of a much more general disintegration in the morals and ethics of Western society. Sorry, that was a bit
It's okay.
broad.
We got 5 minutes, 4 minutes left. Colonel Wilkerson, I guess we can be optimistic that the president poll numbers are down and we have elections coming up, and he doesn't seem to care because maybe he's not going to allow these elections to transpire.
I think there's a very high possibility of that, and I think the Republican Party, such as it is, with a few dissenters, Tom Massey perhaps, maybe a few others, is going to go right along with him in whatever it is he wants to do, whether it's declaration of an insurrection and deployment of ICE and the Praetorian Guard and other forces, or whether it's a little more sublimated. I think he's going to make sure that the Republican Party stays in power, and he's going to put in motion those things that will be necessary to that happening, and that includes the potential, the real potential, and we haven't had this really since 1858, 1859, and some of the circumstances are eerily the same, particularly the kind of differences that are irreconcilable in a democracy, even by diplomatic means. They are irreconcilable. We've got people, for example, who are advising the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, advising him that women should be having babies and nothing else. They shouldn't be doing anything else other than having babies. We've got him holding prayer meetings monthly in the Pentagon. We got him giving prayers in front of the troops when all manner of religions and no religion at all is represented in the ranks to whom he's speaking. But he's being very careful as he discovers these people, even at the flag rank level, generals and admirals, he's getting rid of them. And as he discovers them down at the ranks level, he's putting them where they can't do any harm. In other words, he's shaping the armed forces to be precisely what they were not on January the 6th. That coup d'etat, if you will, that attempt, did not fail because the system held. It failed because the coup plotters were incompetent, and the major way they were incompetent was not getting General Milley and at least a portion of the state power that matters the most, the military, either standing in the wings watching or taking part. They will not make that mistake again. So we are in grave peril, physically, politically, war making, you name it. And the ambassador is absolutely right. This war making is principally about making rich people even richer. Wow. And that goes for Israel, it goes for Europe, it goes for the United States par excellence. And this is a situation that has existed throughout human history, but it's always had its coming and going, if you will. And this coming and going is accompanied by an instrument of man's technological supreme nature, if you will, that no previous iteration of this sort of power surge and power change and failing and rising and going down and so forth has ever occasioned. Not the Mogul, not the Mongol, not the Eastern or Western Roman Empire, not the Persian Empire, perhaps the most powerful of them all. None of these previous empires, as they disappeared from the world and others supplanted them, and rich people made fortunes, no matter who came out on top, had nuclear weapons. None of them.
Wow.
And that's the thing that frightens me most about this current convulsion in the world. It's clear to me what's happening. China's taking over. Her acolytes are all around her. Now we have forced the land power, for example, to be so damn big it's incomparable. I mean, you've got China, you've got Russia, and you've got essentially Iran in it now. And I can't see the subcontinent holding out, so you're eventually going to get India in there, and we're going to be up in the West against 2/3 of the world's GDP, 2/3 of the world's population, and 2/3 or more of the world's momentum. And we're going to use nuclear weapons to stop that. I'm not so sure that Southwest Asia right now, and Ukraine too for that matter, aren't of the warp and woof of this resistance.
Well, on that optimistic, happy note, I must say goodbye. Thank you so much for that, Colonel Wilkerson. And thank you, Craig Murray. Thank you both. This has been, for me, a very edifying 45, 50 minutes of a conversation. I hope to get the two of you back together soon because you make a great pairing on this show. Thank you, Colonel Wilkerson. Thank you, Craig Murray. We'll speak later. I don't know what else to say. Eisenhower Media Network, craigmurray.org.uk. You can get all of his material. All right. Right, Craig?
Good man, Dandy.
All right. See you guys later. We're going out once again with Selena, and vuelto.